Hello everyone, my name is Stephanie Sutton, editor of The Medicine Maker, and I'm delighted to be hosting this fantastic roundtable discussion today on setting the course for novel excipients. Joining me today are 5 experts from the industry association IPEC-Americas, which develops, implements and promotes the global use of appropriate quality, safety and functionality standards for pharmaceutical excipients and excipient delivery systems. Our panelists are Nigel Langley, Kathy Ulman, Meera Raghuram, Dave Schoneker and Priscilla Wislack. To start with, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Dave, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. Dave Schoneker. I'm the president and owner of Black Diamond Regulatory Consulting. I've been involved in the excipient industry for over 43 years, my entire career. I was director of global regulatory affairs at ColorCon for about 42 years. And I am one of the original founders of IPEC and a past chair, and a current member of the executive committee and the IPEC Federation Global Expansion Coordinator.
And then who's next? How about Meera? How about you?
Yeah, hi, I'm Meera Raghuram, and I'm the Director for Regulatory and Sustainability at Lubrizol Corporation. So I manage the regulatory strategy and policy for our health, home, and beauty business. And I have been involved with ingredient issues for a long time. Active in IPEC-Americas, I lead the Regulatory Affairs Committee, chair it, and I'm also on the IPEC board. I have been involved with ingredient, excipient issues, and also on the environmental side of things as well.
And next, Nigel, how will you introduce yourself?
Good. Hi, everybody. My name is Nigel Langley. I'm the Global Technology Director for BASF for our Pharma Solutions business. And I'm also the chair-elect of IPEC-Americas. So from January, for the next 2 years, I will become the chair of IPEC.
And then Kathy.
Hi, my name's Kathy Allman. I'm currently the president and owner of KLU Consulting. I retired from Dow Corning in 2016 after 40 years in their silicones business, 25 of that in the healthcare business. And I retired as the global regulatory manager for their healthcare operations. I currently am a consultant with IPEC-Americas. I'm also the vice chair of the Regulatory Affairs Committee, and I generally help with a lot of excipient related projects.
And then finally, Priscilla.
Hi, I'm Priscilla Wislack. I'm the Global Regulatory Affairs Advocacy Manager at International Flavors and Fragrances. I have over 40 years experience in the industry with food additives and excipients and APIs. I also am retired from Ashland and have been working for IFF now for several years. I'm the immediate past chair of IPEC-Americas and the vice president of the IPEC Federation, and I've been involved with IPEC for over 20 years.
Okay, now that the introductions are over with, we'll get started on the discussion. So earlier this year, the FDA announced its novel excipient review pilot program, which begs the question, why does the pharma industry need novel excipients? And why don't existing excipients meet current needs? Nigel, do you want to start with this one?
Sure, thanks, Stephanie. There's a number of reasons why we need novel excipients, or formulators need novel excipients, because there's so many unmet needs and challenges currently with formulating drugs. For example, many small molecule drugs are very poorly soluble, but poorly bioavailable, and also in some cases poorly permeable. In addition, for improving the stability of biologic drugs, these are large molecules that are inherently unstable. Excipients are used at the later stage in formulation for stopping proteins and peptides from agglomerating. And there's still some room to improve that type of process with new materials. In addition, there's other applications for where novel excipients are needed. in the case of taste masking, very bitter drug actives for pediatric and geriatric medicines. And this patient base find it difficult sometimes to swallow conventional tablets. So if you take an alternative form, then the bitter taste is very important and masked with the appropriate excipient. Also in manufacturing process, like continuous manufacturing, which is a very, very important development that's occurring in the industry. New materials we feel are important here to make that type of process more efficient. And also in 3D printing, which is a new technology potentially for making tablets and different dosage forms. When we consider personalized medicine, do we have the right materials to actually make the optimum 3D printed drug in the future? So to answer your question, there's a lot of needs. Why we need them as well is that many excipients that formulators currently use can be more than 50 years old insofar as they're 50 years ago, and in sometimes even more than that, they were developed. And they weren't developed specifically for the pharmaceutical industry. Most excipients have been taken from different applications, such as the personal care industry or the food industry. So the challenge there is that the formulator doesn't have necessarily an excipient that's been designed specifically for the challenge that they might have. It's not designed for fit for purpose, as we describe. And at the same time, the drug modalities have been accelerating. So the last 10 years, there's been such an advance in different therapies. And we feel that the excipients have not really caught up or had the same pace as that. So for these reasons, there's a need to actually innovate more in excipients, to give the formulator more options to actually formulate these materials in the future in drug development.
Stephanie, I'll just jump in on this as well. And I think, Nigel laid it out pretty well. But I think, to sort of sum it up, I think never have we had as great a need for novel excipients as we do today, for all the different reasons that Nigel had said. But yet, as I know we're going to talk about throughout the interview, the issues with bringing forward a novel excipient have really created a dilemma where, we've never had as great a need for excipients, but we've also had a situation until recently here where there's been an extreme difficulty in bringing forward a novel excipient with any degree of certainty. And that has resulted in many companies no longer really even developing novel excipients. So when you have a situation where you never had as great a need for novel excipients, and you have fewer and fewer companies actually been developing truly novel excipients, we're in a problem, or we're going to have a problem. And so I think that's an area that, again, the FDA program we're going to talk about is certainly a reason why it's so important.
And just before we move on, does anyone else have any thoughts they'd like to add?
I think Nigel did a really good job of summing it up. There's a lot of benefits to patients and the industry, not only like you mentioned with the delivery of the drugs, the stability of the drugs, but also the new manufacturing processes that are being launched at this time.
Yeah, I would briefly like to chime in. Really, folks have covered everything here. When you look at the therapies, the expanding new dosage forms, which didn't even exist maybe 20, 25 years ago, right? Targeted immunotherapies, agents required to provide breakthrough therapies. Talk about combination products, right? Whether it's a biologic drug device combination, all these require unique solutions, and really excipients play a major role. And so this is where really we need more novel excipients.
Yeah, we offer a new paradigm because the traditional formulations and solutions that we had no longer work for the types of drugs that need to be developed. So we have to start thinking new.
And
Yeah,
a
we
good
often
example
talk-
of that, Stephanie, is the vaccines, the COVID vaccines. There was a critical need for some novel excipients to be able to make them work, and some novel lipid nanoparticle type of excipients that had not been previously used were really what facilitated some of the development of the vaccine. So I think that's a great example of where a novel excipient really helped us meet an unmet patient need in a critical situation. And as everybody else has said, there's more and more of these types of situations coming up, and that's why it's so critical that we see an enhancement in how excipient innovation can take place going forward.
And also because of the situation with the vaccines, there was a very critical immediate need. And it shows that when that need is there, you can take steps to make it through that regulatory process, because that may happen more and more in the future.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, they're often referred to as inactive ingredients, but the truth is the excipients coming forward often have some functionality that they really need to assist in the drug delivery or the manufacturing process. So that they're not as inactive as maybe they were once thought to be.
And why has the development of novel excipients not been a priority for the industry? Meera, would you like to open with this one?
Sure, thanks, Stephanie. I don't know if I would say that it has not been a priority for the industry. The issue rather has been perceived hurdles and unknowns on what is needed to achieve success, right? And that has been an issue for industry. So I will give you a few key points that I would like to bring up. So first is we have to recognize that excipient manufacturers are generally part of bigger chemical industry or other organizations. So in general, there may be exceptions. In general, you don't see a excipients industry like you would a pharma industry or a drug or a device market segment, right? So what happens is they're not necessarily pharma or drug manufacturers that would make significant investments and not know how they would achieve success. So let's go further, right? There is no clear answer on what it would take to market a novel excipient, because historically there hasn't been an independent pathway. So excipients are always dependent on drug approval process, right? And so even if you have a very promising candidate that provides unique performance or other attributes that Nigel, Dave, and rest of the panel have already talked about, how do you bring it to market? So it has always been part of the drug approval process. And so development part includes looking at performance, but also a major part of the development is the farm talks or safety studies. So if we look at what information is available, our guidance is available, there is a pharmaceutical safety evaluation guidance from FDA, which was issued in May of 2005. And again, that doesn't provide a clear pathway to say, hey, if you have a novel excipient and you do XYZ, it would be safe to market or it would be acceptable. So that has been a hurdle, and there are a lot of factors which are ambiguous. Now, if we look at the guidance does allude to exceptions to testing. So, there are exceptions where you can use various scientific reasoning to program your safety, to see what safety testing you need to do. But again, the clarity and the definitive input you would get is only if it is picked up by a drug applicant and goes through the drug approval process. So these are kind of all the hurdles that have been there historically for an excipient manufacturer to really go and invest a lot in development of these novel excipients.
Stephanie, I'll just jump in here again as well. I think what it really comes down to as well is it's all about risk and uncertainty. And I think Meera framed it well. And the problem, and a lot of times I think there's a misunderstanding, is some people tend to blame the regulators and say, well, you know, they make it so hard for us to do this. It's not really an issue with the regulators. The regulators are perfectly willing to look at any safety data that you want to submit as part of a drug application and assess the safety. And if you have the appropriate information, there shouldn't be a problem. The problem is really pharmaceutical companies that are risk averse, that are concerned about uncertainty, because there is that uncertainty the first time that you use a novel excipient. Is there enough safety information to support the safety? What's FDA or other regulatory agencies going to say about that data? And will it create a potential delay in getting my drug approved, which is the main focus of the drug company? So drug companies are reluctant to use a novel excipient because of uncertainty risk. And really that's been the thing that we've been talking about a lot within IPEC for many, many years, is how can we lower the risk level so that pharmaceutical companies don't have a fear of the unknown to jump in and use a novel excipient that in fact can many times solve their problem in formulation much better than using existing excipients. And so that's really been the hurdle that we've been trying to get over, is how do we lower that risk threshold to a point where pharmaceutical companies can take advantage of novel excipients. I know of circumstances myself where companies have actually made decisions to avoid the use of a novel excipient that maybe they've looked at in research and said, wow, this would solve all of our problems. And instead, they've chosen to go to a formulation with an existing excipient that actually doesn't work as well and makes I'll call it a second-class formulation that actually is good enough to get by, but certainly not nearly as good as what the drug could have been had it been formulated. And people make those choices, because of the fear of the unknown. And that's really not, when we think about quality by design, that is not quality by design. That is, quality by fear. And that is not what we need going forward in terms of innovation and solving many of these problems that we have today.
If I could just build on that a little bit more. So it's not, if you think about it, the drug companies, they're developing new drugs. So their application is already going to be focused on that new API or that new therapy. And then to put on top of that an excipient that has uncertainty with it, it makes it much more complex. So you can kind of understand why they have the situation that they do.
And there's the technical issue of providing the novel excipients for these new drug applications, but you also can't take the business factors out of this. As Meera said, these excipients are coming largely from chemical companies. Their timeline at looking at R&D is usually very different than a pharmaceutical company who is usually looking 10, 15 years out. Chemical industry is looking at a much shorter timeline. And there has to be some, not just technical advantage, but there has to be a business advantage. And the amount of time that takes to develop a novel excipient, and as Dave was saying, the risk that the pharma companies see when using that, which then extends that timeline even further, it's provided a lot of challenges to both parties to just want to do that innovation, because you do have to show some results. And the result is getting that drug approved. And that timeline has been very, very long without a good regulatory process to help it along.
You think about it from an excipient company perspective. I'm sorry, Nigel. If you think about it from an excipient company perspective, if you're that innovator in the excipient company in R&D and you come up with something novel, something really good that you think would be a great excipient going forward, you know, how successful are you probably going to be when you go to your boss and say, well, I've got this great idea, this great material to bring forward. And when they ask you, okay, well, how long is it going to take until we break even on the cost of the tox studies, et cetera? And you say, well, you know, maybe in 20 or 25 years, we might sell the first kilo. Well, probably you're not going to have that job in research for very long. So, you know, not many people are taking forward those kinds of ideas in the current climate. And again, another reason why we need to change the paradigm. Nigel, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. No, I think this is very good conversation, and you've covered so many things. There's just another thing that I personally have seen sometimes when visiting customers is that, well, we're very interested, but come back when somebody else has actually got this approved. So there's a saying that we often use in the industry is that companies want to be first to be second. And the reality is that a novel excipient currently is only adopted and only in a drug product through the whole process if everything else fails. And as Dave alluded to, it's not the best option that's looked up. It's because nothing else works. And I think that's something also that we really very keen to change that dynamic, because I don't think that helps the patient, or it certainly doesn't. You know, not getting the best optimum drug therapy necessarily, because novel excipients are not normally used where another option is available to it. So just wanted to add that point.
Yeah, well said, Nigel. And just to kind of end it, coming back to the excipient manufacturer, right? Currently, an excipient manufacturer has no way to mitigate or manage their perceived risks with the investment into a new novel excipient, right? Like everything we have discussed, it all goes back to the drug approval process, acceptance by a drug company, incorporation into their development process, and taking it all the way through drug approval. So I think that is where the issue is.
One last point on that I'll make, Stephanie, is if we look at ingredients in almost every other area, okay, there is a clear pathway for how you can take forward as the manufacturer of the ingredient, how you can take it forward to get market acceptance or get it to approved for use, et cetera. If we look at food additives, you can do a food additive petition. You can do GRAS panel assessments, okay? And once it goes through that process, the material can be utilized by anybody for those specific intended applications. So there's an FDA process or a process to take it forward that gives a degree of certainty to that ingredient manufacturer. If you make ingredients for cosmetics, there's the cosmetic ingredient review process, which is sort of similar to a GRAS process. But again, there's high credibility that if it goes through this process and it comes out and says the safety data is acceptable, FDA and others usually find it perfectly acceptable for use in cosmetics. So when we look at all the other kinds of ingredients in similar regulated markets, we have that process where it independently can be reviewed from a safety perspective and then move forward, except in pharma for excipients. This is the only area that I know of where an ingredient has no pathway to be assessed currently, outside of the finished drug application. And although we understand the need to look at context of use issues in the drug application, the safety data on the excipient is the safety data. And just like when you're looking at a food additive, you're looking at data that determines whether or not there is an acceptable daily intake for that. And that can be looked at independent of the drug as well. So this is why, again, the new concept is so important to move forward, because it is the only area where we don't have that. And that's what has resulted in this sort of stagnation of innovation that has occurred in excipients over the years.
Right, even in dietary supplements, there's the new dietary ingredient approval process. Every industry has one, except
every ingredient has a pathway except excipients until hopefully now.
And this is probably a very good time to start talking about, you know, the FDA and the pilot program. Over the years, how has IPEC been advocating the industry and the FDA on this topic? Kathy, how about you start?
As you can see by the background of many of our screen drops, IPEC is 30 years old this year. And we've really been developing a regulatory strategy for new excipients since the inception of IPEC. And in fact, back in the 2005 guidance that Meera referred to, as she described some of the studies that need to be done on novel excipients, that was largely based on some of IPEC's recommendations that the FDA picked up on. Then around 2008, 2009, IPEC actually established what was called a novel excipient evaluation procedure. And as an independent external review of excipients, it was hoped that this program would allow regulators to view excipient safety information reviewed by an independent panel of toxicologists that would then facilitate the approval of, or the review and safety of novel excipients. Unfortunately, it didn't take off the way we were hoping it would. And so around 2015, we realized that we really needed additional support on launching this from the industry. So at that time, we reached out to the IQ consortium and asked them to partner with us to help promote a third independent review of excipient safety. So in mid-2015, IPEC and the IQ consortium had members that were granted a meeting with the FDA. We went in, we shared with them, we actually developed an extensive backgrounder to justify why we were coming to them. We went into them, sat down, we talked about it, and they actually, as a result of that meeting, had suggested some potential pathways for us to pursue in coming up with an independent review process. And then, of course, the IPEC and the IQ consortium both submitted comments to dockets and open meetings where they actively advocated for this independent review. So we were all delighted in 2019 when the FDA first opened a docket where people from the industry could provide comments on whether or not a novel program would be beneficial to the industry and to the FDA. And based on those comments, we believe that's why the FDA came out this year with their pilot program. And so, of course, we were ecstatic when that happened. We don't think it's done, but we're still here, we're still advocating, but we're doing it more with the industry now than as a standalone organization. I might just also mention, although it's not part of the pilot program, IPEC has also just recently published a new safety guide for pharmaceutical excipients, which we will believe will also help people to understand what safety studies might be necessary or appropriate in development of novel excipients.
And does anyone else want to give their take on how, you know, IPEC has been advocating people on this topic?
Kathy just mentioned the new safety guide, and that's really based a lot on the guidance that she referred to earlier that FDA's had out for a long time. So we're really building on that, trying to strengthen the whole process to help FDA with that and evaluating new excipients.
I think, Stephanie, one of the, go ahead, Nigel, I'm sorry.
No, just an additional fact there, and Kathy gave a very nice summary of what we actually have done and the history to that. There was actually a USP questionnaire and survey that was issued. And we think probably as a result of our meeting in 2017, which with the FDA, that was the pivotal meeting for the two organizations because we had a big presence at that meeting. And we felt at that time that we'd really connected with the FDA on this topic. And what the FDA then actually stimulated interest through the USP to issue this global survey aimed at the formulator and specific questions that some of us actually had some input into as well on this panel at the time. And based on that sort of response, it was an overwhelming response actually to the survey for this need. So things sort of went sequential. So I didn't want to overlook the USP's part because they actually helped to facilitate not just two organizations saying for the same thing, but the whole global picture here. So yeah, it's a very interesting area and an interesting journey. I mean, we've made a lot of progress. Years where we all went very quiet. I think the last challenge, unfortunately, was with the COVID pandemic, because we had to wait for another 12 months or so, and we understood the reasons for that. And then we have this pilot review program, which is very exciting. And we've really support the listening to the stakeholders through the FDA, and you know, we're very, very supportive of what's been done now with the FDA. So.
Even though the pandemic delayed some things, I think it also showed the importance of novel excipients, because we now have that in 2 of the vaccines.
Well, I think this is also a great example of where timing, you know, sometimes it takes to have certain things develop to the point where it gels, right? So, for example, and Nigel, I think referred to this earlier, or Kathy did, you know, I mean, the concept of an independent pathway for novel excipient review has been on IPEC's agenda from day one. I mean, I was there, I was one of the founders. We established the original objectives of IPEC, and right up there with harmonizing excipient monographs was developing an independent pathway for safety review. So in 1991, when we started IPEC, this was one of the reasons we started IPEC, to find a way to solve this problem. But I think what happened when we developed our own independent panel, like Kathy said, it was with world-class toxicologists. But from the user's risk perspective, there was still a concern that, well, if FDA is not part of that assessment, do we really still not have uncertainty? And so I think, that's why the program didn't take off the way we thought. But what's happened here, I think, in the last 5 or 6 years since we really started having these discussions with FDA about this program, is I think FDA kind of has been coming to their own understanding that, wow, we're going to need novel excipients for us to see the innovation on drug development go in the way that we want it to. And so I think, it was a matter of, the sun and the moon and the stars all had to sort of come out together and get aligned. And I don't think the timing was right early on, where everything was aligned and everybody understood the need. And now I think, the stars and the moon and the sun have been aligned. And I think the FDA, as much as industry, wants to see novel excipients get developed, because, again, FDA now understands the need. They understand how, if we don't do something, it may hinder drug development going forward. And I think so we finally have gotten all sides on the same side, if you will, that let's find the right way to move this forward. And this pilot program is certainly, it's an experiment at trying to find that right way. We think it looks like it has a lot of potential. Obviously, it needs to be successful, and so FDA learns from this, and we can establish a more permanent program going forward. But I think that alignment was something that maybe wasn't there back in the 90s and the early 2000s, but lately everybody is more on the same page of how do we bring this stuff forward, at least here in the US, and obviously we're going to need to get the same thinking process going, globally.
I do want to kind of briefly comment on the ad hoc efforts, right? I think the panel has talked about the IQ and IPEC consortium and really focused effort, which has brought us a long way. But we have, as IPEC, we have been discussing with FDA on various excipient issues, right? The inactive ingredients database, the approved excipient listing, the amounts that you can use. And so as part of that, we have been talking to the farm talks people and all the genetic side as well. You know, the excipients, when you talk about novel excipients, there are many existing excipients that may be used in a new route of exposure, right? You may be repurposing it for a different performance benefit. And so novel excipient doesn't always mean new chemical entities, but really tweaking existing excipients too. In a way, they would fall under the novel category because they have not been present in an approved drug. But the amount of data and information and dossier that you need for these entities may not be the same as a new chemical entity, right? So all the members in this panel and more IPEC members have been having these discussions with different FDA stakeholders on this issue for a long time as well.
I might just mention, I think Nigel mentioned that USP had the survey. Actually, even before that, when we launched the program just from IPEC for the independent tox safety review, USP had agreed at that time to look at drafting a monograph for an excipient before it was used in an approved drug product, so that when it did get approved, the monograph would be ready. Unfortunately, like we mentioned, the program wasn't as successful, but we're hoping now that we have this pilot that USP will consider that again going forward to help have it ready when the industry is ready, when the drug product gets approved, so that there is no delay in that as well.
Yeah, Kathy brings up an excellent point that I forgot about as well, that USP has the pending monograph process.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that's restricted to APIs. So with this novel excipient program, and we have had some effort in the past to see if we can get the pending approval or pending monograph process incorporated for excipients, but that's going to actually require FDA's approval to do that as well. USP can't just go out and do that themselves. But that would also provide a pathway that while the excipient is being independently reviewed by FDA, there may be a possibility then to extend the pending monograph process to these novel excipients so that you can have that process going concurrently with FDA and USP, which would really help a lot.
Yeah, I think, Priscilla, you make a good point. I mean, we had some really good discussions with USP on that a number of years ago. There was an interest there, but there was some concern about how that could fit in with their current policies because there wasn't an independent review that FDA did. This new process, I think, really does open the door again to start initiating those discussions with both USP and FDA as we see the pilot come to bear and hopefully be successful. You know, I think that would be a great discussion for us to then have with them, you know, as we get into the next stage of what this program might look like, because having a quality standard already developed and ready to go when in fact you now have the safety assessment completed, that really gives everybody everything they need to minimize risk and use these things and moving forward, because obviously any safety assessment needs to be based on a certain quality of the material. And it'd be nice to know that that standard has been established when the material starts getting utilized for the first time by pharmaceutical companies in a drug. So there's a lot of synergies there because, you know, we've talked a lot about the safety side of things, but the quality side of it goes along as well. And if you don't have that established, then that becomes sometimes another hurdle. So, you know, USP can't publish a monograph on something until it actually has a precedence of use. But this concept of a pending monograph, if we can kind of get over some of the internal policy hurdles that exist, really would have some benefits and again, facilitating the use of these novel excipients once they go through the independent novel excipient review program that has been proposed.
So just to add, and maybe this helps to summarize some of this, is that I think this example that we're talking about is an industry challenge. It's not just one part of it. It's multiple challenges. And I think what we've experienced, and I know we have experienced, that through collaboration with various parts of the pharmaceutical industry itself, that you can actually drive some success. You can't, it's very challenging to do this independently, right? You have to do it as such a big task that we were confronted with. We have to do it in collaboration. So and then it's, and that's the collaboration feel is moving forward is also very important. If we think of, if this pilot review program is successful and it becomes a full program, which we all hope on the panel in the industry that it will be, then how do we globalize this in some case, in some effect? I mean, how do we, because the US is just one, obviously one regulator, this is a global issue. So, you know, we're starting to have some thoughts of how we can best approach that. But I sense it's going to be the same way, that we would have to get some other stakeholders to join us in this quest to be successful on a global base as well.
And obviously the proposals for the pilot closed recently. What are you all most excited about this program, and what do you hope to see come out of it? What kind of innovations are you hoping to see? Priscilla, how about you start this one?
Sure, Stephanie, thank you. First, I think kudos out to FDA, not just from IPEC and the organizations we've collaborated with, but even our individual companies for establishing this pilot program. This is really key to getting everything started. And we really hope that the pilot will lead to the establishment of a more formal program and also expansion of it beyond the limited scope to other types of novel excipients in the future. Meera had just mentioned, you know, it's not just new chemical entities. There's different routes of administration, different applications, different levels of use that are all defined as novel excipients. Right now, for the pilot program, there's only going to be 2 excipients each year for 2 years that are chosen, which is an excellent start. But, you know, companies have a lot of other novel excipients that we've been trying to get some traction on for years. And the lack of this review or an approval system has been a real challenge for us. So we see that if this pilot's successful, and we have every expectation that it will be, that future expansion will incentivize companies to develop more novel excipients and encourage pharma companies to consider using them if they know there's a more clear pathway for approval, like Dave was alluding to, that it's taking part of that risk factor out of it for everybody. So we believe that the program is really going to encourage more early development and use of novel excipients to facilitate advancing the next generation of medicines for patients, and to also stimulate excipient innovation in the global pharmaceutical industry. We were just talking about, this is a US program, but it's going to have global implications. There's really no process in any country for this that's official. And I think a lot of countries do look to FDA to see what they're doing. And we just had a meeting with the PDG, the Pharmacopeal Discussion Group, which is the USP, EP, and JP. And one of the major excipient topics that we've asked them to take on is novel excipients. Because as organizations like FDA look at developing a regulatory process, as Nigel was saying, the compendial process becomes a part of that. And we really want to have, you know, everybody on the same page to the extent that we can globally. So I think this pilot is an excellent start, and we really commend FDA for starting this. But this just opens the door to, you know, other things other than truly novel excipients, but in meaning new chemical entities, expanding it, maybe opening it up to more generic applications, because right now it's limited to innovator drugs. So there's just so many different options out there that can be expanded on once this pilot is done and hopefully is very successful.
Stephanie, a few points I have on this. I think Priscilla and Meera had really hit on some really important points here. And I think overall, to your question, you know, if this pilot is successful and it moves forward to a full program, you know, I personally think this is probably the greatest thing for innovation in excipient and drug development that I've seen in my career. Like I said earlier, I've been sort of fighting for this as many others have since the early days of IPEC. And to see this starting to come to fruition, I really think it will open the door to innovation in ways that we've never really dreamed. And so, you know, there's a lot of excitement that I've seen around the industry about this program as it came out. You know, as an example, as a consultant involved in this kind of activity, I've actually had quite a few companies contact me and want me to help them and give them advice about whether or not they should try to bring forward their novel excipient into the pilot program or not. And I'm glad to say I actually did help one company submit a proposal for a candidate. So these proposals did start to come in time for the deadline. So to your question about excitement, I think there's a lot of excitement out there. But I think the thing that I want to emphasize again that Meera and Priscilla touched on, what's going to be so important to the success of this program is that the scope of the program, absolutely, it's critical that it be expanded to allow for all types of novel excipients, all the different things that are now defined as a novel excipient, to ultimately be able to take advantage of this program, be assessed independently. It can't just be focused on new chemical entities or chemically modified materials that have never been used before. If that's the only scope that the program will have, I fear that the success will be limited of the program, because there's only going to be so many materials that fall in those categories that people are going to be willing to spend millions of dollars on tox studies on, et cetera. However, where I really see the biggest benefit of this program long term, of where many candidates might fall in, is if you can start opening this program up to things like co-processed excipients, new routes of administration, higher levels of use, use of things like food additives and cosmetic ingredients for the first time in a pharmaceutical application. There are many candidates that fall into those categories that can provide significant benefits to both patients and to drug development that this program could enhance. That right now, a lot of those materials never get looked at because of the same fear, even though everybody always talks about new chemical entities, and they're really important that we address them, no question. There's a lot more candidates that fall into these other categories. So it's going to be critical that as FDA, and we understand why they limited the scope in a pilot program, because they're trying to look at sort of worst case scenario where they got to look at a lot of tox data, et cetera. And for a learning phase in a pilot program, that makes sense. However, once we get through the 2-year pilot, this expansion to other types are going to be extremely important. One other thing I just want to mention, and this is something probably more for us to talk about, after the pilot and we see, an expansion to this, and that is one other area that at IPEC we'd probably like to have some discussions with the FDA down the road, is a little bit about, maybe refining the definition of a novel excipient. Right now, all of those things that we've mentioned fall into this definition of novel excipient, which then creates this sort of uncertainty and fear on the part of the user many times. We do believe that, in some of these other cases, there could be arguments meant to say, well, they're really not so novel, really. I mean, they're unique in that they weren't used in that specific way, but these in many cases are materials that have been around for years, or there's ways to do bridging arguments or other types of discussions to show why you don't need a lot of additional data. There really should be very little concern about any safety concern. And so I think the area of novel excipient definition, both with the FDA and then ultimately with global regulators, is something that I think IPEC would like to have further discussion with as a next phase, to see maybe there's a way that further flexibility could be built in, and not just everything having to go through the program with a full safety assessment kind of thing, because that's maybe not necessary in terms of true risk assessment and trying to streamline processes and improve innovation.
I'd like to go back to something Dave was just talking about too. We've been mainly talking today about the benefits for the excipient manufacturers, for the pharma companies, certainly benefits to the regulatory process, but ultimately the potential public health benefit of novel excipients is really the key, and that we're all focused on. We know that by not having this regulatory pathway right now, the drugs are not optimized because there isn't that pathway. So this really does open up the potential for novel excipients to really provide more meaningful pharmacokinetic properties, characteristics for drugs that lead to the novel drug development that right now we don't have that capability to pull out right now. And that's a very, very key thing. You always have to keep the patient in mind. They're the true benefit.
I have to smile thinking, hearing everyone reflect back that we started this journey about 30 years ago. And yay, we got to this point. We're hoping it doesn't take another 30 years to meet some of the milestones that we've talked about during this interview.
I want to emphasize what Priscilla said from a little different perspective. And I think it's really important because I think this opened the eyes of the FDA as well. When we had some of the early meetings with them, which started, getting this whole idea going, I think one of the things that the FDA was a little bit shocked about was we actually had folks from the IQ consortium, from big pharma companies, innovator companies, who actually presented specific case studies of where drug products that would have significant patient benefit, the projects were killed because they had the fear of using a novel excipient that in fact would have solved their formulation problem. Instead of bringing it forward and having that risk, they actually killed the drug, which meant all the patients that could have benefited by that drug never got that drug. And I think when that got presented, not just from one company, but from multiple companies, and it was clear to the FDA that actually drugs were not being developed that could have been, had there been an easier pathway, I think that really was a bit of a light bulb going off saying, oh my goodness, we need to do something. If we're actually stopping drug development programs that could have gone forward, I mean, what a shame that is for those patients. And I think that's really, you look at different time points when there was a voila moment. That was a voila moment, I think, for FDA and others that helped move this concept forward.
Yeah, it's a good point, Dave. I know our company has submitted a candidate for the pilot, but we've been working with customers for a number of years on things that maybe aren't just new chemical entities, like Meera was referring to, modified excipients, different levels of use. And we've all run into, we use the phrase formulate by IID. If it doesn't fit the IID parameters, then there's been a lot of reluctance to try to move forward even with a modified excipient because it's considered novel. And this is something that as this program moves forward, hopefully we'll get away from that formulation by IID and we'll be able to use these excipients in more novel ways, even the existing excipients. And that will certainly expand particularly the use of generics, because the generic industry is really clamoring for this type of approval process.
So maybe I can add just one thing here. And I just pick up the theme that I mentioned before about collaboration in the industry. What I personally like to see, and I'm hoping this would happen, is that pharma companies and excipient companies will get much closer together. And that transparency of what is the need that they're looking to have, and how can you help, and how can we work together to try to find a solution. And if that comes from this exercise, I think we're making real progress. Because currently it's a little bit different. It's, well, what do you have? It's already launched. And then you get questions, well, can you change it? No, it's already been launched. An excipient, if it's a novel excipient. So what I personally would like to see that we get closer, we actually have those meaningful conversations early in the development process. And then you get buy-in from each side. And,
That's a great point, Nigel. I know in our experience in working with some of these things that are considered novel excipients, collaborating with our customers has been very important, but it's also something that leads to a lot of frustration because nobody wants to get the answer to formulate by IID. And it's something that we hope will change things now. It has been a frustrating process for both sides on the industry, the makers as well as the users. So this opens up some new opportunities for us.
Yeah, I can give an example of that frustration, Priscilla, that I know you've experienced as well. Even with something as simple as a co-processed excipient of materials that maybe are extremely common excipients that have been, say, spray dried together to give unique performance. It can do all kinds of wondrous things in terms of performance in that co-processed form. But in fact, there's been no chemistry that was created. There's all kinds of analytical evidence that shows that. But I've been involved personally, in the past, where people would try out samples of this type of material, and they'd say, "Oh my goodness, this is phenomenal material. This solves all my problems. It improves my process. The product has better properties. This is great. Why don't you come back after somebody else uses it first, and then we'd be glad to put it in." And you go, well, wait a minute, you just said it solves all your problems. It's a great thing. There's no safety risk because we've got the analytical data. It's common materials. Anybody with a brain would not think there's safety concerns here. And yet people have said, we don't know, and come back and talk to us. Like what Nigel said, the statement we say over and over again when we do our presentations on this is, everybody wants to be first to be second. But if nobody's first, nobody gets to be second. And that's the problem we've had historically.
And that's a good point, because we've heard for many years now that there's an option to submit bridging studies for things like that. And it's not as if there was no option. There has been. We've seen what FDA would expect in bridging justification studies, but the fact is nothing's really gone through that. So having a more formal process should really facilitate that.
And Meera, listening to everyone else, is there anything you want to add about your excitement with the program?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Yes, very excited about the program. Industry in general is. One point I'd like to make is FDA made a comment that further decisions on the pilot program would be made based on how many applications they received, how much excitement there was, and how pharma is going to adopt novel excipients. So my comment would be that even though industry has been advocating for a long time, the pilot program announcement came and there wasn't much time for everybody to make their submissions, right? And also there was some hesitancy also because some industry may not have had their dossiers fully ready, or the amount of farm tax justification that may have been required to make that submission. So there was some hesitancy as well, because this is new, how will this be evaluated? What information will be posted publicly, and how would that impact future adoption of such excipients? So I would, my input to FDA and generally the industry would be really that to give this program, to expand it and continue to evaluate and not use this 2-year as a filter, if you will, to make further decisions. Yeah.
And we are starting to run out of time, but before we finish, I want to ask the panel, looking to the future, what further activity or discussions do you think are the most important? Obviously you've discussed lots of different things, what you'd like to see after the program. What do you think are the real big priority areas?
Well, maybe I could just jump in. I mean, just future expansion of it. This is a great idea to have the pilot. It's obviously very focused right now, but like we've been talking about, we really need to get this expanded to all types of novel excipients to be able to get away from our current paradigms, to also have other countries look at this process and hopefully adopt things from that. So just the expansion, and particularly expansion into generic pharma as well, not just novel and new innovator drugs.
I think
I would go ahead, Kath.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's also going to be important, as Priscilla reflected, and so did Dave, that pharma companies partner with their excipient manufacturers to develop the packages that are going to be necessary for the evaluation, because just the safety studies are very expensive. And if the excipient company is taking on that full responsibility, as Priscilla had mentioned during an earlier discussion, the management at these companies is chemical and they change quickly. And if you don't really have a substantiation why you should spend money on something that's not going to be commercial for a while, it's tough. So by partnering with the pharma companies and working together, and even having them do some studies with their active drugs along with the excipient, I think will go really far in promoting the evaluation, independent evaluation of them.
Yeah, good point, Kathy. I guess I'd sum up my thoughts about the future, Stephanie, really, and this is reiterating some of what's said, but I want to just sort of capture it in that I think there is really two critical areas to the success of this program long term. And one has been said over and over again, but I can't stress it enough, and that is expansion of the scope to cover all the types of novel excipients. That will be absolutely critical to the success of the program and the overall use. And that also then would apply to some of these different types of novel excipients being utilized in generics. And number two is really, and I think maybe Nigel had mentioned something about this earlier, is really going to be how can we take this program that is hopefully going to be successful here in the US and globalize it to a point where the same sort of concepts for independent review can be used for excipients around the world. This is going to be, again, I think very critical because, large global pharmaceutical companies, they like to have one formulation for the world. They don't want to have a different formulation that works really great with novel excipients in the US, but then they have to do something else elsewhere. So again, the US is a great place to start for this, and a lot of people look to the US to lead in these areas. But it's going to be very critical that we get, Europe and Japan and China and India and everybody else on board with this long term. So I think, once this program it turns into a permanent program, and we certainly hope it will, and I would say it must. We have to have this turn into a permanent program, or we're going to have major problems in drug development down the road. But once we do that, I think we really need to find a way, and we already had some discussions within IPEC and IQ about how can we turn this possibly even into something like an ICH guide, or work this through ICH to start getting, global acceptance of this concept and have some harmonized guides, if you will, on how excipient safety evaluation could be done. If we could get it discussed at that level, then it could be more easily adopted by countries around the world. Now, ICH is doing a lot of things and they have a lot of priorities. It may take a while to get this to be on their priority list, but certainly one of the future challenges that we have at IPEC and at IQ is going to be, how do we get that done? We've managed to get this going here in the US, but our next challenge is, how do we get global regulators on board? And we're going to be looking to the FDA to help drive that, hopefully, once they become comfortable and hopefully happy with this program.
And to that point, based on what Kathy was saying before, we've been at this for what, 30 plus years now. Hopefully now that we're at this stage, that next step to maybe get to something like ICH won't take quite as long. And
I think we can say we're not going to give up, right?
True.
We've been at this for 30 years. And now that we've got some incentive, we're going to find a way to make this happen. Like you said, hopefully it won't take another 30 years. But if it does, we're still going to be around pushing these concepts because they're absolutely critical and we're not going away.
And just one final thought, and I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think the science is also something that will come through hopefully as well with this in the future. What I mean by that is that we mentioned functionality rather than inactive. And maybe that's a term that's adopted in the future, that excipients have true functionality. And I think the science then shows that there's an equal place for us in the industry from the science of excipients, not just the drug component part or the API. So hopefully the science will get better and we get more realization of the importance. And it drives for designing materials in the future more for fit for purpose. Designed for specific applications rather than trying to adopt something that hasn't been designed that way in the past. So I think we have a very bright future, both on the regulatory landscape, the adoption, and also the scientific view as well. Yeah.
Okay, few points that I had on this issue, and the panelists have covered almost everything. But last but not the least, I do hope that FDA will issue some policy and guidance, especially updating the 2005 farm tax guidance. And that will help industry a lot in anticipating and being able to be responsive. The second point I would like to make is there is precedence even within FDA, if you look at medical devices, where they are trying to spur innovation by having people come and consult with FDA on their developmental projects with really no strings attached, right? And they're willing to meet with developers, even if you're not a drug manufacturer or a device manufacturer. So that kind of consultation with the excipient industry, when we are really developing novel excipients, would be very helpful and welcome. So those are kind of my few points here.
I think we've covered a lot of ground, and it's been great to hear how much excitement there is about the program, and to think about what comes next, and to also start thinking about the challenge of global progress and how we roll this out further. There's a lot to think about, and I want to thank all of the panelists for making the time to participate in this discussion today and to give their views on the FDA pilot program and the future of novel excipients. To everyone watching, please look forward to future discussions and collaboration between IPEC-Americas and the Medicine Maker. And thank you all for taking part and for listening today.